You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. During the 2023 summer movie season, there was a surprise hit at the global box office. No, not that one. Oppenheimer. Directed by Christopher Nolan, the biopic chronicled the life of University of California, Berkeley professor J. Robert Oppenheimer, and it dramatized how he and a team of physicists invented and tested the world's first nuclear bomb at Los Alamos, New Mexico, in July 1945.
Are we saying there's a chance that when we push that button, we destroy the world?
Chances are near zero.
Near zero.
What do you want from theory alone?
Zero would be nice.
The film has gone on to earn almost $1 billion worldwide, and part of its success surely stems from the anxiety many are feeling about the state of nuclear weapons. The last time a nuclear weapon was used in war by one country against a military enemy was August 9, 1945, in Nagasaki, Japan. It was the second and last time. In the 78 years since then, as the number of countries with nuclear weapons increased from 1 to 9, and wars have been fought in countless places around the globe, no country has detonated a nuclear weapon in war. In a speech to the United Nations in 1953, General-turned-elected President Dwight Eisenhower told the world nuclear war was unwinnable, unsurvivable, unthinkable. He talked about the aftermath of a nuclear strike and said,
"Surely no sane member of the human race could discover victory in such desolation. Could anyone wish his name to be coupled by history with such human degradation and destruction?"
It was a pretty powerful idea. Nuclear weapons were so horrible that they were unusable for 78 years. But more recently, there's been plenty of loose nuclear talk. From Russia, with one of the world's biggest arsenals, from North Korea, to speculation about the Middle East, where Iran is bound by, or maybe not, an agreement to carry on nuclear research for peaceful purposes only, while Israel, mailed fist in a velvet glove, is a nuclear power unofficially. What changes when a weapon, the use of which was unthinkable, now seems thinkable? Are there levels of gradation of risk, of danger? Would the use of a so-called limited-yield battlefield nuclear weapon be different from the kind of explosion that levels a whole city and kills everyone in it? Or once the nuclear genie is out of the bottle, are we really just arguing about details? Shannon French is director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence and a tenured professor in the philosophy department at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And Matt Korda is a senior research fellow for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, where he co-authors the Nuclear Notebook, an open-source estimate of global nuclear forces and trends. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much for having me.
Shannon French, you're a scholar of the ethics of war. What separates the atomic bomb from the long list of advancements in weaponry in the 20th century? Poison gas, the tank, long-range artillery, bombers, the machine gun. I mean, it was a pretty deadly century for the technology of killing people in war. What makes the atomic bomb its own category?
Well, it's a great question because you're absolutely correct that technology is often driven by war. And we have seen, unfortunately, quite a lot of deadly, lethal innovation. But in the case of nuclear weapons, with any weapon, we have to ask the two main areas of just war principles are proportionality and discrimination. Now, we know that a nuclear weapon can't be discriminate. If wherever it is dropped, it is going to affect everyone within a certain radius. So already you have a concern about being able to keep it in that just war tradition. But also on the question of proportionality, something that stands out with nuclear weapons is that we know the radiation lingers, and not only in the sense of an environmental issue and a human issue lingering in the area, but it also can have intergenerational effects. So we're talking about one act, one strike, potentially killing and affecting and harming throughout many, many years and many, many, many people. I would like to note, by the way, that even in the Old Testament of the Bible, there is a strong statement under the Code of Deuteronomy that says you can't cut down fruit-bearing trees. And the argument given for that is that it causes intergenerational harm because of the amount of time that you have to regrow it to the point where they will produce fruit again. And if you think of that in this kind of context, the permanent or at least long-lasting damage from nuclear weapons might be uniquely awful.
Matt Korda, earlier this year, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, issued a public warning. He said, we're at the highest risk in decades of a nuclear war that could start, and I think this is critical, by accident or design. Is he right? And what's the evidence?
Absolutely. So first, we are entering really unprecedented times when it comes to nuclear weapons, right? As you mentioned, during the Cold War, there were only 2 major nuclear superpowers, and today there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons. And these countries have a lot of different interlocking deterrence dynamics with each other, so that changes to one country's nuclear posture can then prompt changes to another country's nuclear posture, and that prompts changes to a third country's nuclear posture. And it goes down the chain. And this is the world of multipolar nuclear security risk dynamics. And not only do these security dynamics intersect with each other and make nuclear war more likely, but an increase in nuclear-armed countries also means an increase in nuclear-armed decision makers. And these leaders are subject to their own personal whims and emotions, and frankly, at times, irrationality. Deterrence theory for many decades has been predicated on this idea that world leaders or leaders with nuclear weapons in their possession are going to act rationally all the time. And there is a lot of emerging scholarship to suggest that, first of all, not only is that not necessarily the case, but also we are seeing this play out in real time, right? Many world leaders that are either currently in charge of nuclear arsenals or could potentially be in charge of nuclear arsenals in the very near future don't act in a manner that I think many of us would consider to be particularly rational. And so what we're seeing is that these leaders are increasingly willing to be a lot more belligerent in how they talk about these nuclear weapons. So, for example, throughout the war in Ukraine, Putin has made overt nuclear threats against NATO and the United States. North Korea regularly makes nuclear threats against the United States. Pakistan and India make nuclear threats against each other. And very recently, an Israeli cabinet minister suggested using nuclear weapons in the context of the ongoing war in Gaza. Many of these things, particularly the last one, are not rational. Right? So what really worries me is that leaders are very much leaning more and more into this quite belligerent nuclear rhetoric. And every time that happens, it contributes to sort of almost a normalization of nuclear use and a deterioration of this nuclear taboo that you spoke about that's been in place for more than 75 years. Right? You really never want a situation in which nuclear weapons have become so normalized in how countries engage with each other to the point where at the outset of a crisis, leaders feel compelled and they feel almost encouraged to reach for those weapons. But to me, it very much seems like this is sort of where we're heading, especially as arsenals continue to develop and expand.
But Matt Korda, in those hotspots that you ticked off, isn't the old balance of terror philosophy in play? In the 2000s, coincidentally, in a very close stretch of weeks, I interviewed Pervez Musharraf after we found out about AQ Khan and Pakistan's nuclear program. India had been a nuclear power for some time, and I interviewed the defense minister of India. And to sort of sweeten the pot of this coincidence, because of partition, Pervez Musharraf was born in what is now India, and the Indian Defense Secretary was born in what is now Pakistan. And I said, could you guys, I asked them both, really use this bomb, in effect, to destroy your own hometown, the place where you were born? And they said what I guess sounded in context like the right thing. I would hate to have to. It would be a terrible thing, but I would if I had to. I hope it doesn't come to that. The I hope it doesn't come to that part seems to be getting lost in these last couple of months.
Absolutely, right? And increasingly, we've seen that leaders are very much willing to sort of do away with that all-important second clause, right? This idea that nuclear weapons should always be the last resort in a conflict. And increasingly, what we're seeing is that leaders are willing to potentially make it their first resort, right? And that is a really, really serious and dangerous territory to be in. And something that we're seeing as well that really concerns me is that not only do we have world leaders who are increasingly just more interested in reaching for nuclear options, but we're also seeing that many of these countries are increasingly changing and tweaking their force postures to basically incentivize them to reach for these weapons first in a conflict. So you have not only these kind of emotional responses from the leaders themselves, but the way that the arsenals are postured with really very much with an emphasis on first strike weapons, warfighting weapons, taking this emphasis on retaliation that was sort of the backbone of mutually assured destruction for so long and putting that on the back burner. And instead thinking about, okay, how do we use nuclear weapons at the outset of a conflict to fulfill our strategic objectives? That to me is very worrying, right? Because you have not only the emotional nature, but the technological nature of these arsenals that is pushing us a little bit closer and closer towards nuclear conflict.
Professor, I want to hear from you on this. Does just talking about it, like having Putin intimate Dmitry Medvedev blithely speculating about the possibility of using nuclear weapons, regular threats on Russian television by Kremlin-approved commentators, does it really make such a weapon easier to use? Or is it just because you have it, you know you can shake it at the people you're trying to scare? Does talking about it really make something more possible, in your view?
Well, one thing I think that worries me is that there's a lot of loose talk around language that I think minimizes what nuclear weapons really do. So, for example, you frequently hear people, and certainly the Russians are guilty of this, talk about deploying tactical nukes. And what is extremely misleading about that is, you mentioned earlier, the strikes on Japan at the end of World War II. The bomb that hit Hiroshima was, if I recall correctly, a 15 kiloton weapon. And when we talk about what falls in the tactical versus strategic buckets of nuclear weapons, tactical can theoretically be as broad as 1 to almost 100 kilotons. Anything above 100 or 100 and above is considered a strategic weapon. So we're talking about levels of damage that should not be tossed about as if they would somehow fly under the radar of people's sense of horror and disgust. They would not. Any use of nuclear weapons at any of the levels we have available today would have tremendous impact in every sense, including the ethical response of the international community. There would be no complacence. And so I think the rhetoric is dangerous because the rhetoric may actually mislead some of the people making the decisions, and they may push towards the use of weaponry that they don't understand. That worries me greatly, and it doesn't sadly just worry me in these examples we've given so far. It worries me in this country as well, because I've absolutely heard Americans who should know better talk about tactical nukes in this way.
You know, it's been a while. I as a Cold War kid, I grew up doing periodic drills, climbing under my desk, crouching in the hallways once they figured out that hiding under the desks with line of sight to Lower Manhattan probably wasn't going to save our lives very much when the big one came. But I think people have gotten out of the habit of worrying about nuclear devastation. So we have to sharpen up our vocabulary. Matt Korda, remind people what the difference is between a strategic and a tactical nuclear weapon, the way they're used and who they're meant to kill.
Absolutely. So, and this is where we get into really kind of scary stuff, right? So strategic weapons, which are traditionally those weapons that have aimed to have been limited by arms control treaties, which, by the way, we now officially basically no longer have, right? We're now in the first point in about 50 years in which we no longer have any active arms control treaties that limit deployed strategic offensive nuclear arms between the United States and Russia. This is really dangerous, right? So the strategic weapons that have traditionally been limited by these treaties are things like intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers and the warheads associated with those. Those are meant essentially to attack either a combination of military targets or civilian infrastructure that is related to the military war machines of a particular country. The United States has a policy, right, that says we don't nuke cities. That all sounds very nice on paper, but it's incredibly difficult to put that into practice when a lot of these targets, right, like leadership targets, munitions factories, things that are absolutely valid targets, quote unquote, valid targets under the US laws of armed conflict, many of those are located in or near very large population centers, right? And so it's the way that we often talk about targeting, and it is always this very abstract idea of targeting counter force, right? Either countering another country's military forces or counter value, targeting something that is of value to leadership, meaning specifically cities and civilian population. And there's often this really stark line that's drawn between them when we talk about targeting in kind of these policy contexts. But when you scratch away at the surface of that, you realize, oh my gosh, there actually is not so much of a distinction between these two things as we think there's going to be, because even if we try and not target a single city and we're only targeting the particular infrastructure and leadership targets and all these things, a lot of civilians are going to die and get hurt. It's incredibly difficult to disaggregate these two categories, and yet this is kind of the conversation that the policy sphere is often stuck inside.
And what about battlefield nuclear weapons? They've started to rear their heads again. What are people talking about when they refer to them?
Yeah, so we often hear talking about tactical nuclear weapons or non-strategic nuclear weapons. And I guess I would say that the community itself, the community that studies and thinks about policy with regards to nuclear weapons, generally doesn't have a very good definition for what constitutes a tactical nuclear weapon. It can have something to do with the yield, it can have to do with the targeting or the range or the types of missions that it's meant to support, or perhaps it refers to a type of weapon that isn't covered by these sort of strategic arms control treaties. But generally, it's almost kind of one of those situations where you kind of know it when you see it, right? You know, okay, these ICBMs, these big submarine launched warheads, those are strategic, and then, you know, everything else is kind of tactical, right? And these are weapons that are absolutely coming back into the conversation, right? Russia has, by all accounts, thousands of these weapons. Many of them are left over from the Cold War. The United States is also modernizing its own, albeit smaller arsenal, but still an arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Many of these are forward deployed within Europe. So at bases allegedly in the Netherlands and Belgium, Turkey, Italy, Germany. And so not only between the US and Russia, but you also have, in the context of the conflict between India and Pakistan, right? There are a lot of tactical and non-strategic nuclear weapons floating around in those arsenals as well. And these are sort of the weapons that many people fear would be the first weapons to be used in the context of a nuclear conflict. These are sort of the really scary things, right? The strategic nuclear weapons are almost, that comes later, right? Once we're actually in a nuclear war, right? And these are the types of weapons that can really sort of end the world. But the tactical ones are the ones that people really fear, okay, if a leader wants to reach for a nuclear weapon in a conflict, they're going to reach for a tactical nuclear weapon.
I was just going to add that you talked about the difference between counter force and counter value, which I appreciate that comes up a lot in these conversations. And you correctly noted that that line is so blurry or thin or non-existent. But I would also point out that on the military ethics side, as you alluded to, Ray, earlier, there are some weapons that even if used against clearly military targets, even used against exclusively combatants, are still considered out of bounds. And we have, again, somewhat vague language for that, but it centers around the language of unnecessary suffering. And if there's any weapon that is known to cause unnecessary suffering, it is the nuclear arsenal, because, of course, as we know, those who survive the initial blast then have to suffer the lingering, painful death that follows, or even many years later, deaths from cancer and so forth. So even though it hasn't been enshrined as we would like it to be in international law this way, I mean, we've banned blinding lasers and we haven't banned nukes, but there is this understanding that some weapons are bad in and of themselves.
But I wonder, Professor, whether mutually assured destruction, testament and the day after, the very grave emotional affect that surrounded the late Gorbachev-Reagan talks, where a lot of the big arms deals were signed, whether that era worked so well that we had the luxury of forgetting just how terrible what you're describing is, that we got to a place where fewer and fewer people remember picking up a newspaper and seeing a mushroom cloud, seeing people with burning flesh coming off their limbs and that kind of thing. And now we can almost be more careless about it because the horror of these weapons has diminished with their lack of use.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm Gen X, so I grew up watching The Day After. My British husband had the equivalent over there, which was a movie called Threads, which was very haunting and disturbing. And I remember not only the drills, but the lingering sense of doom. There was this sense of it being possible, the music of the time. There was so much in the atmosphere of the sense of this is, in fact, how we could all die planet-wide. Plus, again, the additional concept of the horror that came with this unique weapon. And I absolutely agree that that has faded. My students today, who are mostly Gen Z and soon to be Gen Alpha, I guess, are not familiar with that. And when you ask them what they are afraid of, this is sad in and of itself, but they go to mass shootings, school shootings. It's things that they have drilled on their whole lives. And when you start talking about nukes, they don't have that language, they don't have that context, they don't have that sense. And I think that's disturbing. Now, I think we should note that the MAD policy, the mutually assured destruction, has held all this time. And arguably, Russia has tried to use it to keep everyone out of their business as they illegally invaded Ukraine. But the fact that it hasn't worked, that people are still supporting Ukraine and are in effect saying, we're not afraid of you, Russia, even though you have nukes, is kind of a mixed blessing. I am someone who proudly supports the Ukrainians in this conflict, and I definitely am glad that the rest of the world is doing so as well. But it does worry me that we're no longer shuddering when Russia says we could nuke. And I think that could get worse and worse as time goes by, that the old Gen X phrase of, oh, whatever, so you have nukes, we don't care, you've been threatening that for years, is not really the attitude we need right now.
Matt Korda, do you have to be afraid of a boy who cried wolf problem? I remember so well when the Union for Concerned Scientists would release its latest doomsday clock, and it seemed like we spent decades just a couple of minutes to midnight, and nothing ever happened. And when you start to raise the alarm again, because this is a weapon that hasn't been used in 78 years in war, maybe people say, they're always saying we're really close to something bad happening, and nothing bad happens.
It's a great point. My sort of thoughts on this are that now, in particular, this incredibly unique moment, this is exactly the time to be raising the alarm. We are really very much at an inflection point in the context of global nuclear arsenals, right? Not only are arsenals developing incredibly fast, we're seeing countries like China, North Korea make almost exponential gains with regards to their nuclear arsenals. But we're seeing that every single nuclear armed state is deciding to recapitalize on their existing arsenals. In some cases, they're actually expanding the number of weapons that they have, right? Not just sort of replacing old weapons with new ones, but actually growing their stockpiles. We're seeing that every nuclear armed state is decreasing their level of transparency with regards to nuclear weapons. So increasingly, it's going to be a lot more difficult for us to actually understand what it is that they're building. And to top it off, we're in the midst of these extremely intense tensions, right? Geopolitical tensions that, at least from my perspective, is certainly making the prospect of nuclear war more likely than at any point since the end of the Cold War. There are certainly steps that countries could take to walk us back from the brink, But right now we are sort of creeping closer and closer to that edge. And that to me is very worrying. So now is the time to sort of sound that alarm.
Well, Shannon French, you heard Matt Korda describe the current state of play. As you look at this, what would you say to the audience about how to keep these weapons where they've been since 1945, beyond use? How do you make it just a line item on a military budget, but not something we're actually lobbing at each other?
Well, I mean, first, I don't mean to be gloom and doom here, but I agree with what Matt said earlier about the fact that many of the leaders we're talking about in these times are not necessarily rational actors. So that means we need some rational actors to be well aware of these threats, to take them seriously, to recognize that we don't know if someone might decide that they want to go out in a blaze of glory and they don't care if the world burns. So we have to take all of that as a risk that, as Matt said, has potentially never been higher. So what that's going to mean is that we need an increase in everything that has in the past helped to keep us safe. That's going to mean including human intel. We let a lot of our human intel slide a little bit and in some ways became over-reliant on some of the tech. And that's not always going to be enough when we're dealing with unstable parts of the world. We need to really have still human beings with instincts in the mix who can read these situations and really tell what's going on and what might happen, and not just play it out as if it's a game, because the stakes are too high for it to be a game. And we also need ordinary citizens, and this program is trying to do that, to be aware of what nukes can do once again. And I mean, personally, I'd love to see them remake one of those terrifying films. I don't know how to get to the people who would do that, but we really need people to reawaken to the fact that this risk is not identical to the others. There is something here to be taken especially seriously, and some of the smartest people that have ever been on this planet have warned us against it, and we need to hear them.
Matt Korda, to close, we've talked about various world flashpoints over the course of this conversation. I want to end in the Middle East. Recently, the Grand Ayatollah basically said, you guys are on your own. We are not coming in on your side of the war, to the various Palestinian factions. Given what we know about Iran and the JCPOA and the sort of tenuousness of that, was that a relieving moment for you and your program?
Well, certainly, anytime a country that has even sort of a nascent nuclear program is staying out of a regional conflict, that is certainly a good thing, right? So what we certainly don't want to see is this conflict spiral into a larger regional conflict that implicates other countries, could implicate the United States. And what I think there is an opportunity for is, to the extent that we can, the United States should really be trying to re-engage Iran on arms control, and specifically on the JCPOA, right? The extent to which countries will be able to sort of walk back into the original agreement, that is a, very open question. But it is clear that Iran is, to some extent, leaving a little bit of the door open for engagement. And so it would be interesting to see what would happen if the United States and its allies were sort of willing to walk through it as well. Whatever it is that the U.S. can do to try and keep that nuclear program from becoming a proper nuclear weapons capability, the U.S. should pursue that.
Matt Korda, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much for having me.
Matt Korda is an associate researcher with the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Shannon French, great to have you with us again.
Thank you so much.
Shannon French is the author of The Code of the Warrior, exploring warrior values, past and present, now in its second edition. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Matteo Schimpf, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.